Hello, and welcome to the Climate Conscious Podcast. I am your host, Virval Bazi, and this is the Demystify series. Join us as we unravel pressing climate and sustainability challenges and innovative solutions. Today, we are demystifying the connection between climate change and occupational safety and health. On today's show, I am joined by Princess Avianne Charles. Princess is a workers' rights activist and writer based in Trinidad and Tobago. She covers human rights, labor laws, climate and environmental justice, and occupational safety and health topics. With a degree in occupational safety and health, she centers her work on providing safer spaces and risk reduction strategies for communities and the environment. Princess, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you so much for having me here. This is such an amazing opportunity to share more on these connections, and I'm happy to be a part of this. Thank you.
So, climate change is reshaping the world as we know it. Rising temperatures affect the environments where we live and work. NASA scientists confirmed 2024 as the warmest year on record, with global surface temperatures being the highest since record keeping began in 1880. The impact of this trend of rising temperature can be seen in extreme weather events, rainfall, heat waves, and flooding. This is expected to worsen as greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise. In addition to the impact on our environment, climate change is also having a significant impact on human health. And depending on your line of work, you may face increasing exposure to climate risk. So, Princess, can you explain the connection between climate change and occupational safety and health?
So, there is a very deep connection between climate change and occupational safety and health. I will usually say that it's similar to just the fact that we are human beings and we are impacted by climate change in any space, whether it be home, whether it be outdoors in public spaces. And that is the similar connection to how we operate at work. For many of us, we are at work more often than we're even at home. So if we're in particular conditions where there is a high exposure to weather events or to conditions that exacerbate climate risks, including heat, including flooding, rainfall, and so forth, we are going to be continually exposed to that because of the working environment and the demands of that job. So climate change is something that exists at work. Workers are impacted by climate change, as are they in any other space. And because of that, there are particular expectations that we would have for workers to be protected in these spaces, given that they are also at risk for climate-related events. For many workers, they have to work in an environment where they are continually facing heat exposure. And of course, as you would have mentioned, with rising heat temperatures, they have to consider how are they being impacted by things such as flooding, by things that include a potential damage to their stock, a potential damage to the things that are within that workspace and how that affects their performance. There are also factors such as drought that affect many workers. I mean, for example, in Trinidad and Tobago and in many other parts of the Caribbean region and even internationally, there are workers who work outdoors that are facing really bad effects because of drought. When you think about farmers, agricultural workers, these people are at the forefront of these impacts, meaning that there is no escape for them in terms of how climate change impacts them. And it actually makes things much worse in their case because of the connection with their livelihood and the fact that they have to rely on these things to survive. The entire scope of work is that for many of us, we have to work to continue to survive. The state of capitalism makes it in that way that if we don't work, many of us are going to question what happens to us tomorrow. on the next week. We don't have resources or support that will continue to keep us going if we stop working. So to be in environments that are impacted by climate hazards and risks, knowing that those same things can impact our livelihoods and in the longer run impact our survival is very alarming. And that connection continues to persist and even worsen if there are little to no recommendations, efforts, strategies, or policies placed to protect workers and the spaces that they navigate in.
As you outlined, for many of us, we don't have the option of not working. However, we're seeing, depending on the sector that you're in and the line of work, the work environment is becoming harsh. It's presenting hazards and significant risks towards your health. So what do we do? But before we get into the strategies and policies to address this risk, I would love to know, Princess, what inspired you to explore the intersection of climate change and OSHA? I know you studied occupational safety and health, but what inspired you to go down this pathway of the intersection with climate change?
Yeah, that's a question that I even up to this day ask myself, knowing that I'm already here, right? And to be honest, climate change was not on my bingo cards. I've been very passionate about occupational safety and health and labor rights. But at the time, which was I think 2 years ago, didn't I didn't consider it in that way. I was just trying to move forward to see how best I can protect workers. It just stood upon me that, in order to do so, I need to learn more about the ways that workers are impacted. I can't just go with this very limited view based on possibly my experiences or the few experiences that I've seen and to say, hey, that's how we're going to take a holistic approach. So in 2023, actually, I saw this opportunity that came up with Girls Care Jamaica for their mentorship program. And that's actually where I said, you know what, I'm going to learn something new this year. So I applied and, I got through it, thankfully. And that is actually where I went down this roller coaster of learning more about climate and letting that navigate my understanding of how workers are impacted. Because when I learned things from Girls Care and the other spaces that I did a lot of wonderful mentorships and training from, that allowed me to say, you know what, if other people are being affected in that way, then how does that also impact workers who, are people as well, and how does this directly impact them at work? So the inspiration really came from a place of me just saying, I want to learn something different. Before, I wasn't exposed to things climate change. I mean, I was in situations, yes, where it was very much prevalent. And I was able to make some connections there. Like you would say that thing, it's very hot, it's getting hotter, things of that nature. But in terms of actually making this grand effort, it really started from that mentorship opportunity with Girls Care that allowed me to then do a mentorship opportunity with Climate Tracker Caribbean, that allowed me to do a mentorship opportunity with Black Eco Bloom, which allowed me to then do a mentorship with the Caribbean Climate Network. So you can see that from there, I just kept going. Like any opportunity that it came with climate, I took it and I let it shape my understanding of climate change and how it impacts communities and more so how it impacts work. And that shaped me being at this stage where I am, that I am leading a project that allows us to really bring this at the forefront.
And I love that you mentioned that you're now leading a project, and that takes us into my next question about your work assessing the prevalence of climate hazards for workers in Trinidad and Tobago.
Yes, so with this particular project, it started initially. I came up with the idea for the Redefining Work Series with Caribbean Feminist, and we were just focusing on anything that we can tackle as it relates to protecting workers in terms of thinking about how policies that are existing, how those can be amended to further incorporate things that weren't considered before, to focus on education and training and so forth. So it started initially with the Redefining Work Series, and then we got the opportunity through the Caribbean Climate Network to begin with something a bit more specific. And because, it's the Caribbean Climate Network, it of course had to be focused on climate change or anything of that nature. So, of course, I just was able to bridge the two and said, you know what? Actually, I'm gonna do something focused on climate change and workers. I've seen many experiences, especially within the past 2 years, where workers were left in very hazardous and alarming instances of exposure, instances where they were working in very hot, high temperatures, heat temperatures, and little to nothing was done about it. And so those things kind of served as a catalyst for me to say, actually, I'm going to use this opportunity to focus on that intersection and do something more concrete about it for us locally. So with this particular project, it is one where we are focused on an array of things. We have a wonderful team currently of 13 volunteers, and we tackle as many topics as we can, making the connections of workers and climate and gender, workers, climate and disability, and so much more. And we do educational sessions, topics, articles. We're actually doing something with our research team right now, where we are working on a survey to gather more data on workers' experiences with climate change in Trinidad and Tobago. And what we're going to do with that is use that to supplement our recommendations, because even though the Occupational Safety and Health Act exists, and that has done a great job where it is used, I should say, to protect workers. There are many more ways that we can have like a more specific and rigid approach to exactly how workers are impacted and exactly what we have to do to protect them even more. And so when I saw so many experiences of workers being in spaces and working in conditions that are so detrimental to their well-being, I said, actually, yeah, we're going to work on something here where we can provide policy recommendations that businesses can look forward to use to adapt in their environments, that can even go as far as within legislation at some point, so that we have the information there. The information will be accessible, and it can be something that anyone can look to if they need guidance in terms of how workers can be protected and further considered against climate risks and hazards in their workplace. So for this project, it's something that we want to take a wider approach with. We don't want to just limit it with just gathering data, but we also want to provide the opportunity for workers to be more exposed to how they can protect themselves and each other. Because there are many places, just if for locally, for example, in Trinidad and Tobago, where worker safety is not a priority, and not many workers even know what their rights are. There's probably no familiarity in some cases that this Occupational Safety and Health Act exists. So they just go to work and just try to do their best, just try to make it through the next day, and that's it. But when it comes to their safety in that space, that's not a priority, because management did not make that a priority, and they did not get the opportunity to be exposed to the right knowledge and information for them to be able to make that a priority for themselves. So they are basically just working out of the sake of survival, which again, thanks to capitalism, right? But in terms of safety, in terms of their well-being, in terms of their long-term well-being, that is not a focal point. And so with this project, we want to make that a focal point. We're just using the starting off point being with climate, given that it's something that is continuing to worsen, and it's something that wasn't given enough focus, in my opinion, before for workers and that worker perspective. So it's something that the Redefining Work Series is trying to push as our goal for this year.
I have to commend you and the team at Caribbean Feminist for hosting the Redefining Work series. I had the opportunity to be part of this series and to be part of a discussion around the intersection of worker safety and climate justice. And one of the important points was the way that climate change amplifies existing inequalities also applies to workplace safety. You can see disparities amongst worker groups. So, for example, low-income workers They often lack information and resources to, adapt or become resilient to these impacts, as well as workers in informal sectors who may not have, again, access to information or resources to make the necessary changes to the way that they work. There's also the issue of migrant workers who would also fall in that category as being more vulnerable, as well as the elderly and disabled workers who may have certain limitations as well as existing or pre-existing health conditions. So age and associated medical factors of these workers exacerbates the way that they experience climate change in the workplace. So these are just some general stats around the issue, but can you tell us some of the key findings that have come out of your research and your work in this area?
I first must say that those key findings are definitely on point. Those are really important things that we consider with this project because we try to take as best as we can an intersectional approach, and we do deeply consider those demographics as well. Given that it is Caribbean feminist, we try to see things especially through a gender responsive lens, a feminist based lens, and we consider the groups that are particularly vulnerable in any space, and then we tie it back to how they impacted as workers and basically how they're impacted by climate change as a whole. And we also consider that it's focused on workers, but also it's not. If you get what I'm saying there, it's not, because we also consider that we are all addressing the workplace. And so we are also addressing hazardous practices that the workplace encourages and how that not only impacts workers, but other people in close proximity in that space, how it impacts communities, and how those work practices also can exacerbate climate risks. So we consider that for workers, for people who people who live nearby in some areas, there are places that are so severe with pollution that the persons in that community are also impacted by that. And that's, of course, because the workplace decided to say, what, they're going to find a alternative route to dispose of whatever garbage that they may have. But that alternative route is impacting the people that live within that area. So we consider everything when it regards to this project, not just workers, but just how work practices can really worsen things for people and for the environment. As it relates to your question, when it concerns the key findings, because we still have the survey ongoing right now, so what I've gathered so far, which is something that I had an idea of anyway, but I'm glad to see that we're receiving data that affirms that. So one of the things that I was very concerned about was people's general knowledge when it relates to occupational safety and health. There are questions. We did the survey in such a way that we wanted to assess everything. So we wanted to assess how their working conditions are, yes. But we also wanted to assess what information that they are being exposed to. We wanted to assess, is management providing them with the tools and resources in terms of how they can protect themselves from climate hazards and risks. How to protect yourself from extreme heat. Are they providing water supply? Are they providing training regarding PPE? Things like that. We realized that a lot of workers, based on what we've gathered so far from that survey, they are not exposed to that information at all. And again, this is something that I had an idea of because we did a few interactive sessions, engagements with persons at Co-Create last year. And there were many workers that also said, what, they didn't even know about these things at all. Like, this is the first time that they're hearing so deeply about how they're impacted by climate change as a worker and what's actually in place to protect them. So that's one of the things that truly stood out for me. And also, we gathered some information so far that expanded beyond demographics relating to gender, because we gave the opportunity to allow persons of different gender identities to also, fill out the applications. And if they wish, they can also share a bit, about their identity on the form. So we were able to now say, hey, what? We can actually bring in that gender responsive approach and realize that those persons are also being highly impacted by climate hazards and risk. And in what ways are they being protected, of course, against the many stigmas that they probably are currently facing. So those are two of the things that really stood out to me so far. Of course, I don't want to share too much because we do plan to, we're publishing the report on this and the policy recommendations later this year. But in terms of that particular question, definitely not many people who have filled out the survey, they don't have the sufficient awareness, or they weren't encouraged enough to further familiarize with climate change risk reduction measures as a worker. And this can definitely impact how they navigate those spaces, because then again, it's not a priority for them because management did not make it a priority for them to consider. And so they're just in this space doing what they can with what little they may have. And we just have to hope that still they come out of these spaces safely. But that's not always the case for some workers, or I should say many, given the environment. And that is something that we really have to look into. And that's what we want to use the survey to do, to really question in what ways are workers still impacted by climate change based on their experience, and also based on what's currently in place or what is lacking from management in many work environments to keep them safe.
Princess, you spoke about the lack of understanding of workers' rights, as well as the lack of respect for workers' rights by employers. And those findings that you share, those preliminary findings, highlight the importance of the work that you are engaged in, having these conversations as part of the Redefining Work Series. Because as you can tell, not everyone is going to pick up a report or pick up the OSH Act or do their own research, but they may attend a webinar or an in-person workshop like the sessions that you had at ARC Co-Create. They may just have a conversation with you, and therefore you're able to engage people and share information, create awareness, and just get people thinking, get people asking questions. And this is an important step in creating change. So again, this work is so important because we know that climate change is complex. It intersects with so many areas of our lives that it can get overwhelming. But we see where there is a role for each person to play. You came into this with a background in occupational safety and health, and now you've tied it into climate change. And we just need more persons to recognize that whatever area of expertise that you are in, there is a connection to climate change. There is a pathway for getting involved in climate action and climate justice.
Yes, definitely. And that's so important because we all can do it, not in the same way. And of course, because, we have different resources and just time even is different for many of us. But we all can, in some way, give some attention and perspective to how climate change impacts us in our communities. And with the Redefining Work series, one of the key things about us is that we're trying to build and increase worker solidarity. Because to be frank, one of the things that I'm still concerned about is just that that's in some way is still missing within many spaces. Just the ability for workers to connect in a way that is loud. And that's because there is still a fear within some workers, within some spaces, to even take that opportunity. The system as it is, this capitalist system, it's still that fear that we should not talk about things that affect us. We should not talk about the fact that we're at risk for climate change. We're not supposed to talk about the fact that we are going to workspaces and there may be something that needs to be changed for our safety and for the safety of those in that space. And we are afraid because, we may be reprimanded. People are afraid to speak because they may lose their job. And of course, they lose their job, they lose their livelihoods, and then, it goes downhill from there. So people are afraid. And we want to continue to create a space where they don't have to be afraid. I mean, I empathize with people because of that, because at some point I was as well, and not everyone would have the same result if they speak up. And so if we build that solidarity, we build that network, you know, there's a louder, a stronger voice so that we can actually say climate change is impacting us. Many of us, I mean, in Trinidad and Tobago, we've seen the exposure to things. I've seen so many occurrences of workers working outdoors, and they have nothing. They have nothing but just themselves and maybe a bottle of water. And they have to go through that because they're just studying the fact that they have to make it through that day with some money at the end. But many won't come out and say what are the risks that they're exposed to and even provide suggestions on how they should be safe because of that instilled fear. So we wanted to create spaces and create opportunities for workers to ask questions, for workers to share their experiences, for workers to be able to hear other experiences, even if it's ours. And be in a space where they don't have to fear that something bad is going to happen because of it. We wanted to create a space where workers can see that we're here. And that is something really important in my line of work with occupational safety and health. And just, I guess, as a person, because I always talk about creating safer spaces. And that is a key role for me with creating a safer space. They need to trust me. They need to find that comfort from me that they can navigate and coexist in that same space and not have to worry about their lives or livelihoods being at stake. And that's what I carried into the Redefining Work Series. And that's what all of us as a team continue to push and encourage with anything that we do, is to create that space that people can feel comfortable to be with us and to share with us and to learn from us and to learn with us. And the Redefining Work Series is such something that I'm so proud of as well, especially because we're targeting something that I again didn't put on my bingo cards, but I'm thankful that everything aligned in the way that it did that led me here to be able to focus on something that, if it's something that I didn't pay so much attention to a few years ago, then you can imagine what would have happened to what's going on with other people who they're just focusing on surviving day by day. And we want to have more opportunities for people to be in this space where they can be much more protected from the existing hazards of climate change. They can be much more protected and they can be considered in ways that they weren't before, that they can have a space to say something, to be influencers of decisions, to be stakeholders in these conversations and policy-making processes. We want so much more for workers and for people in general because they deserve it. They exist. And that's simply why I think that they deserve it. Not because of their labor, not because of what they're contributing in some ways. It's because they exist. What other reason should we have to create? What other loopholes should we have to create for them to jump through to ensure that they're safe? Why should we have to let them beg and plead with us to ensure that they're safe? These are basic aspects of their human rights. And I don't think they should have to negotiate for that or fight for that in the way that they are, or in the way that we are, I should include. It's something that they have rightfully earned because they exist.
I completely agree. So, with that said, are the existing occupational safety and health regulations sufficient to address the challenges posed by climate change?
When it comes to the occupational safety and health regulations, I've had a few concerns with it, just because understandably it's not going to be very specific, just because it's going to be attuned to the entire working environment, different work sectors and work fields. So it cannot be very specific in some ways. It's not going to provide examples of things. That's where we rely on the worker policies. That's where we rely on other forms of documentation to really establish certain things. So I would say that in a grander scheme of things, yes. And that's why with the data that we're gathering, we're not focusing so much on targeting the act. We're focusing on targeting specific policies, because we can use the Occupational Safety and Health Act in alignment with policies that really give that focus in terms of how workers are impacted by different things, whether it be trip and fall hazards, whether it be fall from heights, whether it be because they're working in the energy sector, even. We can utilize policies because businesses can create policies of their own, workplace policies, that keep these things into consideration. And then they can utilize that to forward with trainings and other actions that really center that essence of workplace safety. So I would say again that it's it's sufficient. I mean, what's really required more so is that we ramp up and reinforce workplace safety with policies and actions that it can really have that centerfold in terms of how exactly our work is impacted by climate change. We do, yes, have the national climate policy for Trinidad and Tobago. That I do believe that though it needs to be amended. um but again, it's not going to necessarily have that specific approach to workers. So that's where we need to place that demand that businesses take the opportunity to gather information of their own, utilize information that's accessible even, to strengthen and create policies that center worker safety and how they're impacted by climate change. And of course, use the Occupational Safety and Health Act as that guide, but as that responsibility and duty of care that they must have for workers.
So, in the era of climate change, what are the fundamental policies and practices that employers should implement to create safe workspaces?
Well, that is a really great question, because then it would have to go back to, if they're in the first place considering how workers are impacted by anything hazardous whatsoever. And that alone is something that is not there. So yeah, when it comes to the fundamental policies and practices that employers should implement, the first thing that honestly comes to mind for me is just if they are taking any approach to safety whatsoever. And usually that's where we start because there are many spaces that don't. Um, and so then they have to have that familiarity with what expectations and what legislation is in place. That answer may also be different for many because they won't work in the same setting. It's different for many workplaces. There are workers who are self-employed. There are workers in different environments who they simply just do not have access to the information compared to, a major corporation. And an example of that, which is something that we also consider with this project, there are different expectations for them in terms of how they will navigate with safety. Not to say that we have to absolve them of those safety expectations or procedures. It's just that, they weren't exposed to it the same way. And that is a greater conversation to have, because then that means that with, for example, the Occupational Safety and Health Authority, then things can be implemented differently for them so that they can further familiarize with things in place for their safety and well-being and how to reduce climate hazard exposure. But just for this question, I will more so target the places where it can, a lot more can be done just because of the access to resources. And so when it relates to fundamental policies and practices that they should implement, it starts off first with the, the legislation in itself. Really and truly, it's to first begin with that introduction of the OSHA Act. And then from there, they'll be able to put different things in place and make policies and actions that are more specific to their environment. And why I say that is because when there's a familiarity with the Occupational Safety and Health Act, there are expectations and obligations that each person have, whether it be the employer or the employee. And in that practice, there is an ongoing assessment of the space that you're in. There's actually the legal obligation that they have to ensure that the space is suitable for workers in such a way that they have to ensure that there are thorough inspections, um, a thorough analysis of the space, a thorough analysis of what hazards and risks are there, an assessment of how workers are functioning in that space. And through those assessments, then they'll be able to create, different actions and strategies for how workers should be protected. And even that in itself, they'll also be allowed to create policies that can be more curated and generated based on the experiences of the workers in that space. So a lot of the fundamental aspects of it truly comes from the employer's efforts to assess the space that they have created. They use the Occupational Safety and Health Act as a guide, and they carry forward with the information that they have access to not only inform employees, but to shape how they can utilize information and create practices and policies that can further protect workers in that specific space. So I hope that answers it, because it's the thing with safety is that there's no one-step approach. And often what's missing is that people, and more specifically employers, don't take the time nor effort, or not even to make it a priority, to really evaluate the space that they have created. Just by doing that and making that an ongoing practice, they can shape what's fundamental to workplace safety. But a lot of them keep that as an afterthought, or not at all, or even sometimes it may be considered if, depending on who is hurt, if it's the average worker, it's not going to be a priority, which isn't fair, because the worker is just as important as anyone else. If the worker has to go in spaces where they are experiencing illnesses because of climate change or whatever else it may be, that is something that should be shaping how that space centers and pays attention to safety.
I agree with you that there is no one size fits all, but what is needed is for employers to act with urgency and intentionality to protect workers, to provide safe spaces, and to proactively address the new challenges being created by climate change. Thank you, Princess, for sharing those insights on the deep connection between climate change and occupational safety and health. So, how can listeners learn more or get involved with your work?
Okay, so how listeners can get involved. I have on many things, but more specifically, you can view a lot of the work, I would say, first through the Redefining Work Series with Caribbean Feminist. We are accessible on Instagram, and that's literally at Caribbean Feminist. We're also available on LinkedIn, but yeah, prioritize Instagram first. Other than that, I also have work accessible on the Caribbean Climate Network. So you can just that's also on Instagram, or you can search it literally at the Caribbean Climate Network. And I have a lot of work focused there on climate change. And I've done things also with, the impact of workers as well. Other than that, I do also have some work on the Caribbean Climate Network. So I'm providing you with many options because I utilize any platform that I can get to, in some way, bring forward something relating to workers. So, those are the spaces. Climate Tracker, Caribbean. I've done some work recently through the mentorship. So you're gonna see some great things there focused on workers as well. And other than that, um, you can just follow me directly and you can see all those things as well. And I primarily right now on Instagram at underscore Avianne underscore and other than that I'm on LinkedIn at Princess Avianne Charles. So I'm on some places that you'll be able to view more of my work and just stay in, keep in touch with the efforts that we're making for work and climate justice. I utilize all of the activities of the Redefining Work series, but also with my work with places such as Caribbean Climate Network, for example, So thank you so much, Derval, for this opportunity. When you asked me, I was like, oh my gosh, like, imagine that, right? We had you as one of our very first speakers for the Redefining Work Series with this climate and worker focus project. And now, I'm in this space, sharing more about that and just that whole intersection for this series. And it's such an honor. I'm really excited to continue this line of work. And what I would definitely say to listeners is to find ways to keep in touch with us. Yes, definitely, if you can. you know I'm even also available for people to ask questions. I always create a space for people to come and ask questions as it relates to worker safety, if they need advice, if they want to learn more about anything that we would have shared. We do share our trainings publicly, so anything that they want to access, you can reach out to us and ask. And I just want to say that, this is not something that we alone at Caribbean Feminists can do. This is not something that the climate activists that you see can do only. This is something that we need everyone on board, but especially those who have that sense of power that many of us don't have. Many workers do not have that power, that systemic power that you may consider an employer to have in that same space. And so we have to demand that those with the access to those resources and with the status that they have, whether it be as management, whether it be of another level of authority and governance, we need them to pay attention to how workers are also impacted, to how marginalized communities are impacted by climate change. Because it's one thing if we just on the ground do the work, and it's meaningful and important work that is making progress, I would say, making a lot of progress year by year, day by day, minute by minute. But we need a lot more people on board. And we need to create that space for workers specifically to feel empowered, to feel a lot more empowered than they currently do, and to feel encouraged to find that importance of solidarity with each other, and to be able to say that they're in a space where they can share how they're impacted by that working environment and also be listened to as a part of that process. So I would say that we all have the ability in one way or another. It can be as little as it is within that person's capacity to take a chance and a stride towards work and climate justice, to take that opportunity to step out of whatever comfort zone they may be in, to learn more about climate change, to question how certain actions, even if it's actions of their own, may exacerbate certain risks for others. you know find that encouragement within yourself at some point, even to take that first step. It was literally as simple as me just signing up for that mentorship that led me here. And again, it was not in my bingo cards. So, use whatever source of motivation that you have and let that carry you into spaces with people that believe in the same thing with you, for the sake of the safety and well-being of workers, of communities, and of the environment as a whole. Let that lead you to be in spaces where we all can collectively work for the safety, protection, and well-being of each other.
Beautifully said, Princess. Thank you so much for joining me on the Climate Conscious podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to be here.
If you found this episode insightful, we'd love for you to share it with your network, leave us a review, or let us know your thoughts on our social media platform. And don't forget to subscribe to the Climate Conscious podcast so you won't miss another episode of the Demystify series.